Violence explodes without warning. Silence falls over crowded shopping centers when authority crosses lines into brutality. An arrogant police officer, blinded by power, raises his hand against a seemingly frail, elderly woman. Skin meets skin, creating a sharp crack echoing past storefronts. Shoppers gasp, anticipating a tragic fall. Instead, gravity shifts. Retribution arrives not through courtrooms, but through swift, undeniable physical dominance. She moves with terrifying precision, dropping her attacker to cold mall tiles instantly. Karma demands payment, delivering brutal justice right then and there. This incident destroyed a career, exposed deep corruption, and made history forever. Pinecrest Shopping Pavilion was suffocatingly busy on a late Saturday afternoon. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished marble floors, mixing with the heavy, sweet scent of roasted almonds and expensive perfumes drifting from the department stores. Among the sea of frantic shoppers navigating the crowded corridors was Beatrice Caldwell. At 71 years old, Beatrice moved with a quiet, measured grace that commanded a subtle respect. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, a silk scarf neatly knotted at her neck, and carried a simple, elegant leather handbag. Her silver hair was pinned back immaculately, framing a face lined with decades of lived experience, yet her dark eyes retained a sharp, unyielding vitality. On this particular afternoon, Beatrice had just finished purchasing a fountain pen from a specialty stationery boutique, a retirement gift for a former colleague. She carried the small, branded shopping bag in her left hand, humming a soft, rhythmic tune under her breath as she headed toward the mall's eastern exit. Watching her from the second-floor mezzanine was Officer Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was 32, a patrolman for the city department, who supplemented his income by picking up off-duty security shifts at Pinecrest. He was a man deeply obsessed with his own reflection and the shiny brass badge pinned to his chest. Stocky, with a high and tight haircut and a perpetually clenched jaw, Arthur treated his mall security detail as though he were patrolling a high-stakes war zone. He had a documented history within his precinct of excessive force complaints and escalation warnings, all of which had been buried by a lenient union representative. Arthur thrived on intimidation. He possessed a deeply fragile ego, masked by a loud, booming voice and a heavy-handed approach to even the most minor infractions. Arthur had been tracking Beatrice for 5 minutes. In his mind, he had already constructed a narrative. He saw an elderly black woman walking alone, pausing occasionally to adjust her bag. To his heavily biased and cynical perception, her calm demeanor was suspicious. He decided, without a shred of evidence, that she had slipped something into her leather handbag at the jewelry kiosk downstairs. Adjusting his utility belt to ensure his handcuffs and baton were prominently displayed, Arthur descended the escalator, his boots thudding heavily against the metal steps. He cut through the crowd, deliberately shoving past a group of teenagers, his eyes fixed on Beatrice. "Excuse me, you there. Stop right there," Arthur barked, his voice carrying over the ambient noise of the mall. Beatrice, assuming the loud voice was directed at someone else, continued her steady pace. She was barely 10 yards from the glass exit doors when a heavy, aggressive hand clamped down on her right shoulder, pulling her backward. Beatrice stumbled slightly but instantly regained her footing, planting her feet with surprising stability. She turned around to find Arthur looming over her, his face flushed red with exertion and unwarranted anger. "Are you deaf?" I said. "Stop," Arthur demanded, stepping uncomfortably close, violating her personal space. Beatrice looked at the hand that had just grabbed her, then slowly brought her eyes up to meet Arthur's. Her expression was completely devoid of fear. "Officer, kindly remove your hand from my coat," she said, her voice smooth, articulate, and completely steady. Arthur's eyes narrowed. He was used to panic, stuttering, or immediate subservience. Beatrice's calm defiance felt like a direct assault on his authority. He dropped his hand, but pointed a thick finger at her chest. "I need to see inside that bag, right now." "On what grounds?" Beatrice asked, tilting her head slightly. "I have made a single purchase at the stationery shop, for which I have a receipt. I am now leaving to go home. I got reports of shoplifting," Arthur lied, puffing out his chest. "You fit the description. Open the bag, or I'm taking you to the security office in handcuffs." A small crowd began to form. Shoppers slowed their pace, their attention caught by the booming voice of the police officer and the striking contrast of the dignified, elderly woman he was confronting. "If you suspect me of a crime, officer, you will need probable cause to search my personal belongings," Beatrice replied, her tone remaining conversational, though a dangerous, cold edge was beginning to bleed into her words. A vague, fabricated description does not constitute probable cause. Arthur's face turned a deeper shade of crimson. The fact that she was educating him on the law in front of an audience made his blood boil. His fragile pride cracked. "Listen to me, you arrogant old." He stepped forward, trying to snatch the leather handbag directly from her shoulder. Beatrice shifted her weight, pulling the bag out of his reach with a fluid, effortless motion. "Do not touch my property," she warned. The public denial was too much for Arthur. Logic vanished, entirely replaced by a blind, toxic rage. He didn't see an elderly woman anymore. He only saw a target that needed to be broken. Without a second thought, Arthur pulled back his right hand and swung. He slapped her. It was a vicious, open-handed strike aimed directly at her face. The sound of flesh hitting flesh cracked like a gunshot through the atrium. The mall fell into an absolute, horrified silence. The murmurs died. The footsteps stopped. Every eye locked onto the scene. A woman near the pretzel stand let out a loud, piercing gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Arthur stood there for a fraction of a second, his chest heaving, a cruel smirk starting to form on his lips, fully expecting the elderly woman to crumple to the polished floor in tears and submission. He was incredibly, devastatingly wrong. Beatrice did not fall. Her head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow, a red welt instantly blooming across her left cheekbone. But her body remained perfectly rooted to the marble floor. For 2 agonizing seconds, the world seemed to freeze. The crowd held its collective breath. Arthur's smirk solidified, thinking he had won, thinking he had successfully established his dominance. Then, Beatrice turned her head back to face him. Her dark eyes, previously calm, now burned with a terrifying, focused intensity. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Instead, she exhaled a sharp, controlled breath. Before Arthur could process the lack of tears, before he could even lower his striking hand, Beatrice moved. She did not move like an elderly woman. She moved with the blinding, explosive speed of a coiled spring releasing its tension. Beatrice Caldwell was not just a retired civilian. She was a former master sergeant in the military police and a lifelong practitioner of Krav Maga and Judo. She had spent 35 years neutralizing threats twice her size. Arthur's right hand was still lingering in the air between them. Beatrice's left hand shot up like a viper, her fingers locking around Arthur's thick wrist with a grip like industrial steel. Arthur's eyes widened in sudden confusion, a sharp jolt of pain shooting up his forearm as she squeezed exactly over the pressure points of his radial nerve. "Hey," Arthur managed to choke out, trying to yank his arm back. It was too late. Using his own backward momentum against him, Beatrice stepped deep into his personal space, dropping her center of gravity. She pivoted sharply on her right foot, dragging his captured arm across her body. With her right hand, she delivered a lightning-fast, open palm strike straight to the crook of his elbow, hyperextending the joint with a sickening pop. Arthur let out a high-pitched scream of agony. His knees buckled, but Beatrice wasn't finished. Maintaining her iron grip on his wrist, she drove her right leg behind his left calf in a flawless textbook sweep. Deprived of his balance and blinded by the sudden intense pain in his arm, Arthur went airborne. His 220-pound frame was completely at the mercy of the 71-year-old woman. He slammed face first into the unforgiving marble tiles with a deafening thud. His nose shattered on impact, spraying a brilliant arc of blood across the white floor. The breath was violently knocked from his lungs, leaving him gasping like a beached fish. Before he could even attempt to recover, Beatrice smoothly transitioned her weight. She dropped her knee squarely onto the back of his neck, pinning him to the floor, while simultaneously twisting his hyperextended arm up behind his shoulder blades in a brutal submission hold. The entire sequence, from the moment Arthur slapped her to the moment his face smashed into the floor, took less than 3 seconds. The crowd erupted. It was total bedlam. Shouts of shock, awe, and terror echoed off the glass ceilings. Instantly, a dozen smartphones were thrust into the air, their camera lights flashing, capturing every agonizing second of the police officer, pinned beneath the impeccably dressed senior citizen. "Get off me!" Arthur shrieked, his voice muffled by the floor and thick with blood. He thrashed wildly, but Beatrice shifted her weight just a fraction of an inch, applying more pressure to his shoulder joint. "Do not move," Beatrice ordered. Her voice was no longer conversational. It was a commanding, authoritarian bark that cut straight through the chaos of the crowd. "If you struggle, I will dislocate this shoulder. Do you understand me?" Arthur whimpered, the fight completely drained from him, replaced by a humiliating cocktail of extreme pain and absolute disbelief. Okay, my arm. You're breaking my arm." Standing a few feet away, a 19-year-old college student named Tyler Owens had his phone recording in stunning 4K resolution. He had started filming the moment Arthur had grabbed Beatrice's coat. Tyler's hands were shaking, but he kept the frame perfectly steady. "Holy," Tyler muttered under his breath. "She just dropped a cop. Somebody call an ambulance for this man," Beatrice announced calmly to the surrounding crowd, not taking her eyes off the back of Arthur's head. "And call the real police. Tell them an off-duty security guard assaulted a civilian and has been detained. You assaulted a police officer." Arthur spat, bubbles of blood forming on his lips as he pressed his cheek against the cold tile. "You're going to prison for the rest of your life, you crazy." Beatrice leaned down slightly, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for him. "You let your uniform make you brave, boy, but you forgot that a badge doesn't teach you how to fight. Now, breathe through your nose and stay completely still." In the distance, the shrill wail of approaching sirens began to echo toward the mall. The spectacle had reached a fever pitch. Shoppers were cheering, some were crying, and everyone was recording. The invincible, arrogant mall cop had been thoroughly and decisively dismantled, but the physical takedown was merely the prologue. The true destruction of Arthur Pendleton was only just beginning. Within 5 minutes, the eastern entrance of the Pinecrest Pavilion was flooded with blue and red strobe lights. 4 uniformed officers burst through the glass doors, hands resting nervously on their holstered weapons. Leading the charge was Sergeant David Miller, a 20-year veteran of the force. He scanned the massive crowd, expecting to see a dangerous suspect holding hostages. Instead, the crowd parted willingly, pointing toward the center of the atrium. Sergeant Miller stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw dropping beneath his thick mustache. There, in a puddle of his own blood, lay Officer Arthur Pendleton, whimpering and pinned to the ground by an elderly woman in a beige trench coat. "Police, nobody move!" Miller shouted by pure instinct, though he was entirely unsure of how to process the scene in front of him. Beatrice looked up at the arriving officers. She did not raise her hands in panic, nor did she attempt to flee. She maintained her hold on Arthur, ensuring he couldn't reach for his utility belt. "Sergeant," Beatrice called out, her voice projecting with absolute authority. "This man assaulted me unprovoked. I have subdued him. I will release his arm when you have secured his weapons. He is armed with a standard-issue Glock on his right hip." Miller blinked, startled by her precise tactical language. He signaled for 2 of his officers to approach. "Ma'am, slowly release him and step back," Miller ordered, walking forward cautiously. Beatrice smoothly removed her knee from Arthur's neck, released his wrist, and stood up in one fluid motion. She adjusted her silk scarf, picked up her leather handbag from where it had fallen, and stepped back, her posture perfectly straight. Arthur immediately rolled onto his side, cradling his throbbing arm, his face a mess of blood and snot. "Arrest her," he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Beatrice. "Assault on an officer. Attempted murder. She tried to kill me." The 2 patrolmen hauled Arthur to his feet, groaning under his weight, immediately tending to Arthur's shattered nose and checking his shoulder. Sergeant Miller approached Beatrice, holding up a notepad. "Ma'am, I need your name and a statement. Officer Pendleton is claiming you attacked him." Beatrice dabbed her cheek with a tissue she retrieved from her pocket, wincing slightly as it touched the red welt Arthur had caused. "My name is Beatrice Caldwell. and I highly suggest you interview the 50 witnesses standing around you before you take the word of a man who assaults senior citizens." Tyler Owens stepped out of the crowd, holding his phone high. "Officer, I have the whole thing on video." He grabbed her, yelled at her, and then slapped her across the face. She just defended herself. A chorus of voices erupted from the crowd, validating Tyler's claim. Shoppers pressed forward, offering their names and numbers to the bewildered police officers. Meanwhile, Arthur was being loaded onto a stretcher. His ego, shattered into pieces on the mall floor, rapidly mutated into a venomous desire for revenge. As the ambulance doors closed, Arthur pulled his union rep's phone number from his memory. He knew the system. He knew how to twist a narrative. By the time he reached the emergency room, Arthur was already drafting his official incident report in his head. He would claim Beatrice aggressively reached into her bag for what he believed was a weapon. He would claim she possessed superhuman strength, likely under the influence of narcotics. He would state that his strike was a preemptive defensive maneuver, and her retaliation was a calculated attempt on his life. He was confident his badge would shield him, just as it always had. Back at the precinct, Sergeant Miller escorted Beatrice into an interview room. He offered her a cup of water, treating her with a strange mix of suspicion and deep respect. "Mrs. Caldwell, I have to ask, how did you do that?" "Pendleton is a big guy." Beatrice took a sip of water, her eyes calmly tracking Miller. "Leverage and momentum, Sergeant. Size is a disadvantage if you don't know how to control your center of gravity." Miller sat down across from her, pulling up a background check on his computer terminal. He typed in Beatrice Caldwell. He expected to see a blank record, maybe a few parking tickets. Instead, a heavily restricted file flashed onto his screen, marked with an old Department of Defense seal and several state police credentials. Miller's eyes went wide. He scrolled through the file, his face paling with every line he read. Beatrice Caldwell wasn't just a retired military veteran. She was the former chief defensive tactics instructor for the state's regional police academy. She had spent 20 years teaching cadets how to safely subdue suspects. In fact, looking closely at the dates, Miller realized something that made his stomach drop. She had literally written the hand-to-hand combat manual that every officer in their precinct, including Arthur Pendleton, was legally mandated to study. "Oh my God," Miller whispered, looking up from the screen to the elderly woman sitting quietly across from him. At that exact moment, Tyler Owens pressed upload on his smartphone. He posted the 4K video to Twitter and TikTok with a simple caption: "Arrogant cop slaps old lady at the mall. Gets completely destroyed." The digital spark was lit. It wouldn't just be a localized scandal. It was about to become a global inferno, and Arthur Pendleton, sitting in his hospital bed, typing out his fabricated, lying report, had absolutely no idea that he had just committed career suicide on camera. Fluorescent lights buzzed mercilessly above the sterile emergency room at Pinecrest General Hospital. The sharp, chemical smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol did nothing to soothe the pounding headache radiating from the base of Officer Arthur Pendleton's skull. He lay on the stiff, crinkling paper of the examination table, his right arm bound tightly in a heavy blue sling. His shoulder had been violently relocated by an exhausted emergency room physician, a process that had left Arthur screaming obscenities until his throat was raw. His nose, fractured in 3 distinct places from his catastrophic impact with the mall floor, was packed with bloody gauze and taped securely across his cheekbones. Arthur stared at the drop-ceiling tiles, his chest rising and falling in shallow, angry breaths. He was not processing the fact that he had assaulted a senior citizen. He was only processing the humiliation of his defeat. In his twisted, ego-driven worldview, he was the ultimate victim of a freak occurrence. The heavy wooden door to his room swung open, admitting Richard Gable. Gable was the senior representative for the Regional Police Benevolent Association, a man whose entire 30-year career was built on shielding aggressive cops from the consequences of their own actions. Gable was thick around the middle, wearing a cheap, rumpled gray suit that smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke and cheap cologne. He carried a leather briefcase and an expression of perpetual, cynical annoyance. "Look at you, Arthur," Gable grunted, pulling a plastic guest chair closer to the examination table. The chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. You look like you went 12 rounds with a concrete mixer. Tell me exactly what happened before Internal Affairs gets their claws into this." Arthur sat up slightly, wincing as a spike of pain shot through his rotator cuff. "It was a routine stop, Dick. Shoplifting suspect. Matched the description. I approached her, gave lawful commands to halt. She refused. I closed the distance, and she got instantly hostile." Gable pulled a yellow legal pad and a silver pen from his briefcase. He didn't look at Arthur. He just started writing. "Hostile how? Verbally? Physically? Both," Arthur lied smoothly, the fabricated narrative already crystallizing in his mind. "She refused to show me her receipt. She started making erratic movements, reached into her coat. I thought she was going for a weapon, a knife, maybe a firearm. I utilized a standard open-handed distraction strike to create distance and neutralize the lethal threat. Next thing I know, she's on me. She had to be on something. PCP, meth, something. She threw me to the ground with superhuman strength." Gable stopped writing and tapped the silver pen against his chin. He had heard variations of this exact lie 1,000 times. The reaching for a weapon defense, combined with the superhuman strength trope, was the union's bulletproof shield against excessive force lawsuits. It didn't matter if it was true. It only mattered if it was documented in the official system first. "Perfect," Gable muttered, a grim, satisfied smile touching his lips. "We file the official incident report tonight. Captain Donnelly is already drafting the press release. We're going with officer injured while subduing armed and erratic suspect. We'll request a blood tox screen on the woman. By the time the local news gets it, she'll be painted as a violent criminal, and you'll be the hero who took a beating to keep the mall safe. She needs to be charged." Arthur spat, a drop of blood seeping into the gauze under his nose. "Felony assault on an officer. Resisting arrest. I want her put away for a decade." "Oh, she will be," Gable assured him, standing up and snapping his briefcase shut. "I'll have the paperwork filed with the precinct commander within the hour. You just rest up, Arthur. We control the narrative. We always control the narrative." What neither Arthur Pendleton nor Richard Gable realized was that the era of controlling the narrative through sheer institutional authority had ended years ago. They were operating under an obsolete playbook, completely blind to the digital tsunami that had already made landfall. 10 miles away, in a beautifully appointed, quiet suburban home, Beatrice Caldwell was sitting in her mahogany-paneled study. A cup of chamomile tea steamed gently on her desk next to a Tiffany lamp. She had applied a cold compress to her left cheekbone, where a dark, ugly purple bruise was beginning to bloom. Her posture, even in the privacy of her own home, was impeccably straight. Her laptop was open, displaying an incoming video call. Beatrice clicked, "Accept." The screen split, revealing the serious, intensely focused face of a man sitting in a high-rise office. It was S. Lee Merritt, a highly prominent, real-life national civil rights attorney, known for utterly dismantling corrupt police departments in federal court. Beatrice had not called a local public defender. She had called the heavy artillery. "Mrs. Caldwell," Attorney Merritt said, his voice deep and vibrating with professional urgency. "I have just reviewed the footage, sent over by the young man at the mall. I also have my paralegals pulling Officer Pendleton's complete disciplinary history. It is extensive. The man is a walking liability." "I suspected as much, Mr. Merritt," Beatrice replied calmly, taking a slow sip of her tea. "A man does not strike an elderly woman in a crowded public space unless he has been taught, through years of institutional protection, that he is completely untouchable." "They are going to lie, Beatrice," Merritt warned, leaning closer to his webcam. "The precinct released a preliminary statement 20 minutes ago. They are claiming you were erratic, that you reached for a weapon, and that Pendleton acted in self-defense. They are formally charging you with aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer." Beatrice offered a cold, razor-thin smile. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster, watching her opponent willingly walk into a forced mate. "Let them file the charges. Let them put their lies into the official federal database. It is one thing to be fired for brutality, Mr. Merritt. It is quite another to be indicted for felony perjury, falsifying government records, and wire fraud. Merritt smiled back, understanding the brilliant, devastating trap she was laying. You want them to dig their own grave before we show up with the shovel? Precisely, Beatrice nodded. I will see you tomorrow morning at the precinct headquarters. Bring the federal filings. While Beatrice and her attorney finalized their legal guillotine, the internet was performing an execution of its own. Tyler Owens, the college student who had recorded the entire interaction in stunning, unshakable 4K resolution, had not just posted the video to social media, he had sent it directly to several massive independent journalism outlets. By midnight, the video had fundamentally broken the internet. The contrast was too stark, too viscerally enraging to ignore. Viewers watched the calm, dignified, impeccably dressed elderly woman, calmly explaining her constitutional rights. They watched the aggressive, vein-popping arrogance of Officer Pendleton. And then, the comment sections erupted into an inferno of universal outrage. But the outrage quickly morphed into absolute, screaming astonishment as the second half of the video played out. The way Beatrice moved, the blinding speed, the perfect biomechanical leverage, the sheer, undeniable dominance as she folded a heavily armed man twice her size onto the floor, became instantly legendary. The internet dubbed her the Iron Matriarch. Digital forensic experts on social media platforms began ripping the video apart frame by frame. They zoomed in on Beatrice's hands, proving definitively that her hands were empty and completely visible at her sides when Arthur struck her. The reaching for a weapon narrative was entirely, mathematically annihilated before the sun even came up. Back at the hospital, Arthur was finally drifting into a painkiller-induced sleep when his personal cell phone began to vibrate violently on the bedside table. Then the hospital room phone rang. Then a nurse rushed into the room, her face pale, holding a tablet. Officer Pendleton, the nurse stammered, backing away from his bed as if he were radioactive. The hospital administrator just called down. We have news vans pulling into the emergency room bay. There are thousands of people calling the switchboard. Arthur blinked heavily, the narcotics making his brain sluggish. What? Why? What are you talking about? The nurse didn't speak. She simply turned the tablet around so Arthur could see the screen. It was a national morning news broadcast. The anchor was speaking with a grave, furious expression. Beside the anchor, playing on an infinite, agonizing loop, was the ultra-high-definition video of Arthur slapping an old woman, followed immediately by him getting slammed face-first into the marble tiles. Arthur's stomach dropped out from under him. A cold, suffocating wave of sheer panic rushed through his veins, entirely neutralizing the painkillers. The official police report, the lie he and Gable had so carefully crafted and signed an hour ago, was now public record. He was officially on the hook for a fabricated narrative that millions of people could clearly see was a violent, malicious lie. His phone vibrated again. It was Richard Gable. Arthur managed to pick it up with his good hand, pressing it to his ear. Dick, Arthur breathed, his voice trembling violently. Dick, the video. I know, Arthur. I know. Gable's voice sounded hollow, stripped of all its previous cynical confidence. Listen to me very carefully. Do not speak to anyone. Do not answer questions from the nurses. I am coming to get you right now. We need to get in front of this before the federal prosecutors see it. It was a pathetic, futile hope. The federal prosecutors had already seen it. The world had seen it. The karma had been dispatched, and it was currently accelerating toward Arthur Pendleton at terminal velocity. Morning broke over the city with a heavy, oppressive humidity, matching the suffocating tension inside the central headquarters of the Metropolitan Police Department. Captain Donnelly, a man who had spent his career expertly navigating bureaucratic scandals, was currently sweating completely through his pressed white uniform shirt. The precinct's media briefing room was packed far beyond its maximum fire code capacity. It was not just local news crews. National syndicates, civil rights advocates, and independent journalists had swarmed the room, their camera lenses locked onto the wooden podium like the barrels of a firing squad. The outrage outside the building was deafening, with hundreds of protesters having gathered before dawn, chanting Beatrice's name. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Captain Donnelly stepped up to the microphone, flanked by a visibly sweating Richard Gable. Donnelly adjusted his collar, trying to project an air of institutional calm that he absolutely did not feel. They had convened this press conference to attempt a desperately late damage control maneuver, hoping to backpedal on the official report without admitting outright criminality. "Good morning," Donnelly began, his voice echoing loudly through the tense room. "We are here to address the incident that occurred yesterday afternoon at the Pinecrest Pavilion involving Officer Arthur Pendleton. The department takes all allegations of excessive force incredibly seriously. We have reviewed the online footage, and we are opening a full, transparent internal investigation." A reporter from the front row immediately shouted over him. "Captain Donnelly!" The official police report released at 10:00 p.m. last night stated the victim was erratic, hostile, and reaching for a weapon. The video clearly shows her hands at her sides. "Did your officer commit perjury?" Gable leaned toward the microphone, his face tight. "We are asking the public not to rush to judgment based on a short, out-of-context internet video. Officer Pendleton had a split-second decision to make. He slapped a 71-year-old woman in the face unprovoked." Another journalist interrupted aggressively. "Why isn't he in handcuffs right now?" "As I stated," Donnelly said, his voice rising in panic, "the investigation is ongoing. We must follow due process. The suspect—" "I am not a suspect, Captain Donnelly. I am your worst nightmare." The voice cut through the shouting of the press corps like a polished steel blade. It was not loud, but the sheer, commanding authority woven into the tone silenced the room instantly. Every camera pivoted toward the heavy double doors at the back of the briefing room. Standing in the doorway was Beatrice Caldwell. She was no longer wearing the casual beige trench coat. Today, she wore a sharp, charcoal gray, tailored business suit. The dark purple bruise on her cheek was visible, an undeniable badge of the brutality she had endured. Flanking her on her right was Attorney S. Lee Merritt, carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Flanking her on her left were two stern-looking men wearing dark suits and earpieces, federal agents from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The reporters parted like the Red Sea, allowing Beatrice and her legal team to walk straight down the center aisle. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rapid, frantic clicking of camera shutters. Captain Donnelly looked like he had just seen a ghost. Richard Gable took a physical step backward, his eyes darting toward the nearest exit. Beatrice stopped directly in front of the podium, looking up at the two men. Her dark eyes were completely void of sympathy. "Captain Donnelly, Mr. Gable, you asked the public to wait for the full investigation. I have saved you the trouble." Attorney Merritt stepped forward, opening his portfolio and dropping a stack of heavily sealed documents onto the edge of the podium. At 11:30 p.m. last night, Officer Pendleton, under the direct advisement of Union Representative Richard Gable, filed an official use-of-force report. In that report, he claimed my client was armed, dangerous, and chemically altered. Captain Donnelly, you signed that report, formally transmitting it to the state database. "This is highly irregular," Donnelly stammered, gripping the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. "You cannot interrupt a police press briefing. I can do whatever I please within this department, Donnelly," Beatrice stated, her voice echoing perfectly into the podium microphones. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a solid brass badge, enclosed in a thick leather wallet, and slammed it down onto the podium next to Merritt's legal filings. It was not a police badge. It was an investigator's shield, bearing the grand seal of the state governor's office. "For the benefit of the press," Beatrice announced, turning slightly to face the cameras, "my name is Beatrice Caldwell. I am not just a retired master sergeant and former chief defensive tactics instructor. As of 3 months ago, I was quietly appointed by the governor as the chairperson of the Independent State Police Oversight Commission. My mandate was to covertly investigate precincts with statistical anomalies regarding excessive force complaints against minorities." The briefing room exploded. Reporters were literally climbing over chairs to get a better angle. Flashbulbs strobed like a nightclub. Captain Donnelly's knees practically gave out. The color completely drained from his face. He wasn't just looking at a victim. He was looking at the woman who held the absolute, unilateral authority to dismantle his entire precinct, freeze their federal funding, and revoke their pensions. I visited the Pinecrest Pavilion yesterday because we received 14 anonymous complaints this year regarding an off-duty officer terrorizing shoppers. Beatrice continued, her voice slicing through the noise. I did not expect to become the primary evidence, but Officer Pendleton graciously obliged. She turned her terrifying gaze back to Richard Gable. You thought you were protecting the department, Mr. Gable. Instead, by conspiring to file a demonstrably false police report across a digital state database, you have committed felony wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of their civil rights under Title 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Merritt picked up the narrative smoothly, pointing to the federal agents standing at the back of the room. Federal warrants have already been executed. Officer Pendleton is currently being taken into federal custody directly from his hospital bed. He will not be returning to this force, nor any force, ever again. Gable opened his mouth to speak, to offer some slimy legal defense, but no words came out. He looked at the federal agents moving slowly down the aisle toward him, carrying zip-tie handcuffs. His career of burying the truth was over, annihilated in less than 24 hours by a woman he had assumed was weak. You relied on an obsolete system of intimidation, Captain, Beatrice said softly, though the microphones picked up every word. You relied on the assumption that a badge grants immunity from physics, from the law, and from accountability. You forgot that power without discipline is just a liability waiting for a spark. Beatrice retrieved her badge, snapping the leather wallet shut and slipping it back into her pocket. She looked at the cameras one last time, ensuring the bruised side of her face was clearly visible to the millions watching live. The era of arrogant men terrorizing our communities with absolute impunity is over, Beatrice declared. If they wish to behave like criminals, we will happily accommodate them with a prison cell. With that, Beatrice Caldwell turned on her heel and walked back up the aisle, moving with the same devastating, unyielding grace she had displayed at the mall. Behind her, the federal agent stepped up to the podium and instructed Captain Donnelly and Richard Gable to place their hands behind their backs. The hard karma had not just hit Arthur Pendleton, it had completely eradicated the corrupt foundation that had enabled him. In the span of a single afternoon, an arrogant bully had tried to assert his dominance over someone he deemed beneath him. Instead, he shattered his own arm, destroyed his own freedom, and inadvertently activated the exact person possessing the power to tear his entire corrupt world down to the studs. True justice, as Beatrice proved, doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it wears a tailored suit and strikes with the speed of lightning. The concrete walls of the federal holding facility in downtown Chicago offered no comfort to Arthur Pendleton. The air inside his small, heavily sterilized cell was freezing, smelling faintly of industrial pine cleaner and despair. He sat on the edge of a thin, rigid mattress, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that felt like sandpaper against his skin. His right arm, still throbbing with a dull, ceaseless ache, was secured in a standard-issue medical sling. The heavy steel door across from him offered no handle on the inside, a glaring reminder that his days of holding the keys, of dictating the freedom of others, were permanently extinguished. Arthur stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, his mind trapped in a terrifying, inescapable loop. Just 48 hours ago, he had been the undisputed king of his small, fabricated empire at the Pinecrest Pavilion. He had worn a badge that, to him, acted as an impenetrable shield against consequence. Now, he was inmate 844912042. His court-appointed federal defender had visited him earlier that morning. Richard Gable, the union representative who was supposed to be his savior, had been placed in a separate cell block, completely cut off from communication. The union had immediately severed all ties with both of them to save its own political skin. The lawyer's assessment of Arthur's situation had been brutally brief and devastatingly bleak. The Department of Justice is making an example out of you, Arthur, the weary public defender had explained, sliding a thick stack of printed indictments across the metal visitation table. You aren't just facing local assault charges. Lee Merritt bypassed the county prosecutor entirely. You are being charged under Title 18, U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Furthermore, because you and Gable coordinated to file a fabricated police report across state databases to cover it up, they've tacked on felony wire fraud and federal conspiracy. But it was a split-second decision. Arthur had pleaded, his voice cracking, the arrogant bravado entirely stripped away. "I thought she had a weapon." The lawyer had simply pointed to a tablet playing the 4K video of the incident, which had now amassed over 70 million views worldwide. "Arthur, the whole planet can see her hands were empty. The jury will see her hands were empty. The federal judge, who happens to be a Reagan appointee with zero tolerance for police corruption, can see her hands were empty. If we go to trial, you will lose. And when you lose, the prosecution will ask for 20 years. Back in his cell, the reality of those numbers finally crushed the last remaining fragments of Arthur's ego. 20 years. He would lose his pension. He would lose his house. He would spend the best years of his life locked in a cage, entirely surrounded by the very demographics he had spent his career harassing and intimidating. The karmic retribution was so absolute, so flawlessly engineered, that it felt less like a legal proceeding and more like an act of divine punishment. Outside the thick concrete walls of the detention center, the Metropolitan Police Department was undergoing a tectonic structural collapse. Beatrice Caldwell had not been bluffing when she declared herself the architect of their ruin. As the chairperson of the Independent State Police Oversight Commission, Beatrice moved with the surgical precision of a seasoned military tactician. She immediately froze the precinct's discretionary funding. Within 3 days of Arthur's arrest, Beatrice and her commission issued subpoenas for every single use of force report filed by Captain Donnelly's precinct over the past 10 years. Armed with a team of forensic data analysts and DOJ investigators, they began dismantling the culture of silence brick by brick. Captain Donnelly, seeing the catastrophic writing on the wall, attempted to submit his immediate resignation to secure his lucrative pension. Beatrice personally blocked it. Instead, Donnelly was publicly fired with cause for administrative negligence and complicity in the cover-up, stripping him of his retirement benefits and leaving him in financial ruin. Dozens of officers who had previously hidden behind the union's protective umbrella suddenly found their old, buried complaints being resurrected and handed over to federal prosecutors. A wave of panic swept through the corrupt ranks of the state's law enforcement. Cops who had built their careers on bullying and unwarranted aggression were suddenly terrified of the citizens they swore to protect, realizing that any one of them could be another Beatrice Caldwell, a quiet, unassuming force capable of utterly destroying their lives. The digital age had fundamentally changed the battlefield. The monopoly on truth, once tightly held by official police press releases, had been permanently broken by the smartphone camera. Tyler Owens, the college student who filmed the encounter, was hailed as a civic hero. He was interviewed on national television, sitting alongside S. Lee Merritt, calmly explaining that he only filmed the interaction because Arthur's body language was aggressively predatory from the very beginning. He hunted her, Tyler told a primetime news anchor, his face grim. He picked out an elderly woman because he thought she would just take it. He thought she was helpless. He was just a bully who finally picked a fight with the wrong matriarch. 6 months later, the federal courthouse was surrounded by a sea of news vans, barricades, and heavily armed U.S. Marshals. The air was thick with anticipation. Inside the grand, mahogany-paneled courtroom, the silence was heavy and absolute. Arthur Pendleton stood before the judge's bench. He looked fundamentally different from the man who had strutted through the mall. He had lost 30 pounds. His posture was slumped, his shoulders rounded in permanent defeat. His hair was thinning, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, entirely devoid of the cruel spark that had once defined him. He had taken the plea deal. The prospect of a 20-year sentence had broken him completely, forcing him to plead guilty to all federal charges, including the civil rights violations and the conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Richard Gable had taken a similar deal, currently awaiting his own transfer to a minimum security federal camp. Sitting in the front row of the gallery, looking as immaculate and unbothered as the day they met, was Beatrice Caldwell. She wore a deep, navy blue suit, her silver hair perfectly pinned. She watched Arthur with cold, calculating eyes, holding no malice, but absolutely no pity. "Mr. Pendleton," the federal judge began, adjusting his reading glasses as he stared down at the disgraced officer. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a more egregious, cowardly abuse of authority. You were entrusted with a badge, a firearm, and the profound responsibility to protect the public. Instead, you used that authority to terrorize an elderly citizen to satisfy your own fragile pride. Arthur kept his eyes glued to the floor, swallowing hard. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room, your immediate instinct was not remorse, but deceit. You conspired to leverage the power of your institution to destroy an innocent woman's life to cover up your own violent cowardice. You are a disgrace to the uniform and a danger to a free society. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. Arthur Pendleton, I sentence you to 108 months in a federal penitentiary, to be followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from ever holding public office, possessing a firearm, or working in any capacity related to private or public security. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals. The gavel slammed down with a sharp, definitive crack. It sounded remarkably similar to the sound Arthur's hand had made against Beatrice's face. Arthur's knees visibly buckled. 2 marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing his arms careful to avoid his surgically repaired shoulder, and began escorting him toward the side door leading to the holding cells. As he was turned around, Arthur's hollow eyes met Beatrice's from across the room. He expected to see her smiling, gloating over his total destruction. Instead, she just looked at him with profound, icy indifference. To her, Arthur was not a conquered enemy. He was merely trash that had finally been taken out. He was a systemic error that she had successfully corrected. Arthur was led through the heavy wooden door, the lock clicking shut behind him, sealing away his freedom for the next 9 years. Outside the courthouse, Beatrice Caldwell stood on the wide granite steps, flanked by S. Lee Merritt and several members of her oversight commission. The flashbulbs of the press corps illuminated the afternoon sky. Microphones were thrust toward her, reporters shouting over one another to get a quote from the woman who had single-handedly brought a corrupt police department to its knees. Beatrice held up a single, black-gloved hand, and the roaring crowd fell instantly silent. The badge is a symbol of public trust, Beatrice stated, her voice calm, resonant, and carrying clearly over the plaza. When that trust is weaponized to inflict violence upon the vulnerable, it is not merely a crime. It is a betrayal of the social contract. Mr. Pendleton has faced the consequences of his actions. But our work is not finished. She looked directly into the bank of television cameras. To the officers who serve with honor, you have our deepest gratitude. But to those who hide behind a uniform to exercise their own personal cruelty, understand that the shadows you operate in are gone. We are watching, we are recording, and we will not hesitate to dismantle you. Beatrice Caldwell turned and walked down the steps toward her waiting car, leaving a profoundly altered world in her wake. She had transformed a moment of terrifying victimization into a masterclass of systemic reform. Arthur Pendleton had swung his hand hoping to break a frail woman. Instead, he had struck solid iron, shattering himself and the corrupt foundation he stood upon into dust. True justice rarely arrives wrapped in perfect, cinematic bows, but when arrogance collides with absolute, unyielding capability, the resulting shockwave alters reality forever. The destruction of Arthur Pendleton was not merely a physical defeat on a cold mall floor. It was the total annihilation of a toxic mindset that equated a uniform with invincibility. Beatrice Caldwell did not just defend her own life, she weaponized her assailant's hubris against him, turning his violent impulse into the very mechanism that dismantled a deeply corrupt institution. Karma, in this profound instance, bypassed the slow gears of fate and delivered itself instantly, proving that power without discipline is always a fatal liability. The Iron Matriarch's legacy endures as a stark, terrifying warning to those who abuse authority. The vulnerable are not always weak, and true strength requires no badge to bring a bully to their knees.